I never thought parking in my own driveway would turn into the most legally significant winter of my life, but here we are. Buckle up, because this story has snow, a blizzard, one absolutely unhinged HOA board member, a city-declared snow emergency, security cameras, a city attorney, a very confused police officer, and the most satisfying community meeting you could ever imagine. And it all started because I had the audacity to park my truck on my own property during the worst snowstorm our town had seen in 15 years. My name is Mark Sanders. I'm 43 years old, I work in commercial real estate, and I bought my house in the Cedarwood Heights neighborhood about 4 years ago. It's a nice neighborhood. Clean streets, well-kept lawns, decent neighbors. The houses all have two-car garages and long driveways. Mine is about 30 feet of concrete running from my garage door straight down to the curb, and I've been parking on it every single day since I moved in without incident. Until that winter. The HOA in Cedarwood Heights is called the Cedarwood Heights Homeowners Association, and on paper it exists to maintain property values, manage the common areas like the small park at the end of Birchwood Lane, and enforce basic community standards. The rules are pretty standard stuff. Grass can't grow past a certain height, trash cans have to be pulled in by a certain time, holiday lights have to come down by a certain date. Normal HOA rules that mostly make sense. Then there's Brenda Whitmore. Brenda Whitmore is the HOA's Architectural and Compliance Chair, which is a fancy way of saying she's the person in charge of writing up violations and issuing fines. She's been on the HOA board for 7 years. She lives 4 houses down from me on the same street, in a house that she keeps obsessively immaculate, right down to the matching mailbox post and flower bed border stones. She drives a cream-colored Lexus SUV, wears a lot of quilted vests, and has a way of smiling at you that never quite reaches her eyes. I'm not saying I disliked Brenda when I moved in. I was neutral. She seemed intense and a little territorial about the neighborhood aesthetics, but I figured that was just part of HOA life. My first real run-in with her was over a basketball hoop I put in the driveway for my nephew when he visited, and she sent me a written warning within 48 hours, saying it constituted a recreational structure that required architectural approval. I moved the hoop inside, filled out the paperwork, got the approval, and we moved on. But that second run-in, the one about my driveway during the snow emergency, that one I was not willing to let go. Let me set the scene for you because the weather matters a lot here. We had a brutal December that year. Temperatures dropped hard in early December and just never really recovered. By the second week, we were already seeing overnight lows in the single digits, which is unusual for our area. The ground froze early and stayed frozen. The streets were getting a light dusting of snow every few days, just enough to be annoying without being dramatic. Road crews were out salting constantly, and you could hear the scrape of plows in the early morning hours. Then the second week of January hit, and everything changed. The National Weather Service issued a winter storm warning for our county starting on a Wednesday evening. Forecasters were calling for 12 to 18 inches of snow over 36 hours, with wind gusts up to 40 miles per hour creating blizzard conditions at times. The governor declared a state of emergency for the region. Our city, following its own ordinance, issued a city snow emergency declaration, which is something they do when snowfall is expected to be severe enough to require emergency snow removal operations. Now here's where the snow emergency declaration becomes critical to this whole story. I want you to understand exactly what it means, because Brenda Whitmore clearly either did not understand it or chose to completely ignore it. Under our city's snow emergency ordinance, when a snow emergency is declared, residents are required to move their vehicles off designated snow emergency routes so that plows can operate efficiently. The city has a network of about 30 major arterial roads and secondary roads that are designated as snow emergency routes. During a declared emergency, you cannot park on those roads. Violators get towed at their own expense. Here's what the ordinance does not say, and this is the key thing. It does not prohibit parking on private property. Not on your driveway, not in your yard, not in your garage. It only restricts parking on the designated public snow emergency routes. I knew this because before the storm hit, I read the city's snow emergency FAQ page that the city emails to all residents every year at the start of winter. I've lived in cold weather climates most of my adult life, and I know that when a snow emergency gets declared, the smart move is to get informed about exactly what the rules are so you don't get towed. My street, Cedarwood Drive, is not a snow emergency route. I double-checked. The snow emergency routes are the main roads and the bigger collector streets. My little residential street doesn't make the list. So the storm rolled in Wednesday night, exactly like the forecast said. I got home from the office around 4 in the afternoon, while the first light flurries were already starting. I pulled my truck into the driveway rather than the garage because my garage was in the middle of a bit of a reorganization project. I had shelving units partially assembled and some boxes stacked in there while I was redoing the storage setup. There was physically room for one car in the garage, and I had my wife's sedan in there because she was home on maternity leave with our 4-month-old daughter, and I wanted to make sure her car was protected and easy to access in an emergency. My truck, a dark blue full-size pickup, went in the driveway. All 30 feet of my own private concrete driveway, not on the street, not on the sidewalk, not anywhere public. My driveway. The storm was serious. By Thursday morning, we had about 8 inches down with more falling hard. The wind was gusting and the visibility was genuinely rough. The city had advised residents to stay home unless absolutely necessary. Schools were closed. My office was closed. I spent the morning feeding the baby and watching the snow pile up outside while periodically going out with a shovel to clear the front steps and keep the driveway manageable so that if we had an emergency with the baby, we could actually get a car out. That's when I first noticed Brenda Whitmore walking slowly down the street in her quilted vest, a heavy coat, wool hat, and a clipboard. She was walking on the sidewalk, which barely had a path cleared on it, and she was looking at driveways. I remember thinking that was a strange time to be doing an HOA compliance walk, with snow actively falling sideways, but I didn't think much more of it. I went back inside. Thursday afternoon, the storm was tapering off but still going. Another few inches had come down. The plows were running on the main roads, and you could hear them in the distance, but they hadn't come down our residential street yet. I went out again to shovel and saw that my neighbor across the street, Tom Gallagher, was also out shoveling. He waved at me and shouted something about the storm being insane, and I agreed. We chatted for maybe 2 minutes before the cold chased us both back inside. Friday morning, the storm was fully done. We ended up with just over 16 inches at my house, right in the middle of the forecast range. It was the classic morning after blizzard scene. Everything blanketed in white, the air cold and still and clear, the whole street quiet because nobody had gone anywhere yet. The city was still asking residents to limit travel and allow snow removal operations to continue. The snow emergency declaration was still officially in effect because the roads were still being cleared. My truck was still sitting in my driveway, covered in about a foot of snow. I had cleared a path around it and shoveled enough that I could get it out if I needed to. But I hadn't moved it onto the street because the street hadn't been plowed yet, and also because I didn't need to go anywhere. At approximately 10:15 on Friday morning, I heard the mailbox slot. I wasn't expecting mail because the mail service was delayed, so I went to check and found a standard white HOA envelope sitting on the entry floor. I opened it. Inside was a formal HOA notice of violation and a fine notice, printed on Cedarwood Heights HOA letterhead, with Brenda Whitmore's signature at the bottom. The violation notice stated that I was in violation of HOA Rule 7.4, which addresses vehicle parking in the community. Specifically, the notice claimed that during the declared snow emergency, parking in the driveway was prohibited because it impedes snow removal operations and creates an unsafe appearance. The fine was $250, with an additional $50 per day if the violation continued. There was a note at the bottom in Brenda's handwriting that said, "Mark, please be a responsible neighbor and move your vehicle to an approved location or garage it immediately." I stood there in my entry hall in my socks, holding that piece of paper, while my baby daughter made little squeaking sounds in the baby bouncer in the living room, and I read that notice 3 times. My first reaction was pure confusion. HOA Rule 7.4 does not prohibit driveway parking during snow emergencies. It doesn't say that anywhere. I know this because when I bought the house, I read the entire HOA rulebook the same way I read every important document, which is thoroughly. Rule 7.4 is about street parking and limiting the number of vehicles that can be parked on the street or in common areas. It has nothing to do with driveway parking. And even if it did, a private driveway is private property. The HOA's authority doesn't extend to telling me what I can do on my own driveway, especially when what I'm doing is completely legal under city ordinance. My second reaction was that $250 is a significant fine that I had zero intention of paying. My third reaction was that Brenda Whitmore had apparently hand-delivered this notice during the active snowstorm, which meant she had been walking around the neighborhood in blizzard conditions, specifically looking for violations to write up, during a city-declared snow emergency, while the governor had advised people to stay home. I pulled out my phone and took photos of the notice, front and back. Then I went to my laptop, pulled up the city's snow emergency ordinance and read it again, just as I remembered. The ordinance restricts parking on designated snow emergency routes. My driveway is not a snow emergency route. Parking on my own driveway during a snow emergency is not only permitted, but is actually the right thing to do, since it keeps my vehicle off the street and out of the way of snow removal operations. Then I pulled up the HOA governing documents, which I had saved as a PDF on my computer from when I bought the house. I searched Rule 7.4. Here is what it actually says, in full. Vehicles may not be parked on Cedarwood Drive or any other common area street within the community for a period exceeding 12 consecutive hours without prior written approval from the HOA board. Driveway parking is permitted and encouraged as the primary parking location for residents' vehicles. Driveway parking is permitted and encouraged, in the actual rule that Brenda cited, as a violation of driveway parking. I actually laughed out loud at that. My wife, who had come downstairs to see what I was doing, asked me what was funny and I showed her the notice. She read it twice, looked at me and said, she cited the rule that says driveway parking is encouraged. She literally cited the rule that says you're allowed to do this. Yes, she did. I spent the next hour doing 3 things. First, I composed a written response to Brenda Whitmore and the HOA board, formally disputing the violation, citing Rule 7.4 in full, citing the city snow emergency ordinance, and requesting written confirmation within 5 business days that the fine had been voided. I made it professional and clear, and included both documents as attachments. I sent it via email to the board's official address, and also printed a hard copy to hand deliver. Second, I went through my home security camera footage. I have a system with 4 cameras, one on the front of the house covering the driveway and front walk, one on the side of the garage, one on the back of the house, and one at the front door. The cameras record continuously with motion-activated storage in the cloud. I pulled up Thursday's footage from the front camera and found exactly what I expected to find. Brenda Whitmore, in her quilted vest and wool hat, walking slowly down the sidewalk past my house at 11:22 a.m. on Thursday, pausing at the foot of my driveway, looking up at my truck, writing something on her clipboard, and then continuing down the street. The timestamp was clear. The weather was visibly terrible. Snow was falling hard, and the wind was visible in the footage from the way it was moving the snow around. Brenda had done a compliance patrol during the active blizzard on Thursday and had come back to deliver the notice by hand on Friday morning. I saved that footage. Third, I sent a text message to my neighbor Tom Gallagher, who I knew had seen me shoveling my driveway Friday morning, just to give him a heads up about what had happened. Tom's response was immediate and spectacular. He texted back, "She did the same thing to me, and to the Hendersons. She left violation notices for everyone on our block who had a vehicle in their driveway. That changed things significantly. This wasn't about me." Brenda had apparently walked the entire block during the storm, clocked every vehicle she could see in a driveway, and issued blanket violation notices to a significant portion of our neighborhood. Over-parking on private property during a blizzard, using a rule that explicitly permits driveway parking. Tom told me he'd already called 3 other neighbors who had received notices. The Hendersons on one side of him, the Nakamuras across the street, and a newer couple, the Akafer family who had moved in the previous spring. 5 households total on our block alone that he knew of, all with vehicles in driveways, all cited under Rule 7.4, all facing $250 fines. 5 times $250 is $1,250 in fines, issued to people for parking in their own driveways, correctly and legally, during a blizzard, under a rule that permits the exact thing they were doing. I called Tom on the phone and we talked for about 20 minutes. Tom is a retired civil engineer, practical and methodical, and he had already looked up the city snow emergency ordinance independently and reached the same conclusion I had. He was furious in a calm, controlled way that was actually more intimidating than if he had been yelling. He said, "We should organize. All 5 households should respond together and request an emergency board meeting." I agreed completely. I offered to draft the joint response letter since I deal with contracts and property documents professionally, and I knew how to write something that would be taken seriously. Tom said he'd contact the other affected households and get their buy-in. By Friday afternoon, I had a group chat going with all 5 affected homeowners. The Nakamuras, Kevin and Jenny, were outraged. Kevin is an attorney, specifically an employment lawyer, but he knows his way around legal documents, and he confirmed my reading of both the ordinance and the HOA rule without any hesitation. He said what Brenda had done was not just incorrect, but could potentially rise to the level of abuse of authority under the HOA's own bylaws. He offered to review any communication we sent to the board before we sent it. Dave Henderson, who lives next door to Tom, said he'd received 2 separate notices because he had 2 vehicles in his driveway. $500 in fines for parking 2 trucks on his own property. Dave is a big, quiet guy who works in construction and is about the most unassuming neighbor you could ask for. He was so frustrated he could barely talk about it without his voice getting tight. Sarah and James Akafer had just moved in the spring before and had never dealt with HOA issues before. They were genuinely worried, thinking they might actually have to pay and that this could affect their credit or something. I made sure to reassure them on the group chat that this was a bogus fine and we were going to fight it together. So I drafted the joint dispute letter over Friday afternoon and into the evening while the baby slept and my wife kept me supplied with coffee. Kevin Nakamura reviewed it and suggested a few additions, including a formal request that the board provide any written legal authority supporting the interpretation that Rule 7.4 prohibits driveway parking during a snow emergency, since no such authority appeared to exist. We also requested, in writing, that all fines be voided within 5 business days and that the HOA provide written confirmation of that void, or that we would escalate to the county mediation board as permitted under our HOA's dispute resolution process. Kevin also suggested we include a line noting that we were documenting all communications related to this matter, which is both true and sends a message. We included it. All 5 households signed the letter, either electronically or by printing and scanning a signature. On Saturday morning, I emailed the joint letter to the HOA board's official address and copied all 5 households. Tom drove a printed hard copy to the HOA board's designated address, which is the property management company office in town, because I wanted it documented that we had submitted it in person as well. Now, the HOA board in Cedarwood Heights has 5 members. Brenda Whitmore is one of them, the compliance chair. The president is a man named Gerald Pratt, who is generally pretty reasonable and keeps Brenda somewhat in check most of the time. The other 3 members are less involved people who mostly vote with whoever argues most loudly. I knew Gerald was the one most likely to listen to reason, so I also sent him a direct email separately, just explaining the situation calmly and flagging that I had camera footage of the compliance patrol being conducted during active blizzard conditions, and that I thought the situation was going to become a community issue quickly. Gerald responded to me by Saturday afternoon. His email was short and clearly written by someone who had already realized this was going to be a problem. He said he was reviewing the situation and would respond formally to the joint letter by the end of the week. He thanked me for bringing it to his attention. He didn't address the substance, which told me he was in damage control mode. Meanwhile, word had gotten around in the neighborhood faster than I expected. By Saturday evening, Tom told me that at least 3 other households beyond our original group of 5 had also received notices from Brenda. That brought the total to 8 households that we knew of, potentially more. Someone on the Cedarwood Heights neighborhood Facebook group posted asking if anyone else had gotten violation notices for driveway parking during the storm, and within 2 hours there were over 30 comments. Some from people who had received notices, some from people who were outraged on their neighbor's behalf even if they personally hadn't gotten one. One comment on that post stopped me cold. A woman named Patricia Mercer, who lives on the far end of the neighborhood, said she had received a violation notice for her driveway even though her car was in her garage during the storm. Her notice had cited the wrong property number. Brenda had apparently written down at least one address wrong during her blizzard patrol and had fined someone for a vehicle that wasn't there. I screenshot that comment immediately. The public pressure was building fast. By Sunday morning, the neighborhood Facebook post had over 60 comments, and someone had done the rough math on the fines. If 8 households were fined, that was at minimum $2,000. Dave Henderson alone was facing $500. Someone in the comments had pointed out that the HOA has to report where fine revenue goes in its annual financial statement, and a few people were asking pointed questions about whether fine revenue was being used appropriately. Sunday afternoon, Gerald Pratt called me, not emailed, called, on my personal phone number, which meant he'd looked it up. He sounded tired and a little stressed, and he got to the point pretty quickly. He told me that after reviewing the situation, he agreed that Rule 7.4 did not support the fines that had been issued. He said the board would be voiding all the driveway parking violation notices from the storm event, and that formal letters confirming the void would be going out within the week. He asked me to pass that information along to the other households in our group. I told him I appreciated that, and then I told him I had one more concern. I said that Patricia Mercer had received a notice for a vehicle that wasn't in her driveway at all, and that I was concerned about how the compliance patrol was conducted. I said I had camera footage of the patrol taking place during active blizzard conditions when the city was advising residents to stay home. I said I thought the community deserved some kind of explanation and that a board meeting would be appropriate. Gerald was quiet for a moment, and then said he'd put together a board meeting as soon as the roads were fully clear, probably the following week. I said that was great, and then I mentioned, very calmly, that we were also looking at whether the pattern of fines constituted an abuse of authority under the HOA's own bylaws, which allow for the removal of a board member for cause, and that Kevin Nakamura, who is an attorney, had offered to advise the affected households on that process if they chose to pursue it. I was not threatening anything. I was just stating facts. But I think Gerald understood what I was saying. The following week, the roads were clear. The snow had been plowed and was piled in gray mounds along the curbs and in parking lots everywhere. The temperature had dropped again and everything was frozen solid. It was that ugly phase of winter where all the pretty white snow has turned into dirty ice and everyone is tired and cold. My driveway was fully clear and functional. My truck was back in regular rotation. Life was mostly back to normal, except I had a community meeting to prepare for. The HOA board scheduled an emergency meeting for Thursday evening at 7 o'clock in the community room of the small clubhouse at the end of Birchwood Lane. The clubhouse is a modest building with a meeting room that seats about 40 people comfortably. When I arrived at 6:50, there were already close to 60 people there and more coming in behind me. Folding chairs had been pulled out and lined up in extra rows. People were standing along the walls. I had never seen this many people at an HOA meeting, not even close. Gerald Pratt was at the front table with 3 of the other board members. Brenda Whitmore was also at the front table, and she was the only person in the room who looked like she thought this was all completely normal. She had her clipboard, her reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and an expression of composed self-righteousness that honestly took a specific kind of commitment to maintain, while 60 angry neighbors filed into the room around her. Gerald opened the meeting and quickly acknowledged that the board had voided all violation notices issued during the storm event related to driveway parking. He said formal written confirmations had been sent out. He said the board recognized that Rule 7.4 did not support those notices and apologized for the inconvenience. A hand went up immediately. Dave Henderson, quiet construction worker, raising his hand calmly and asking in his measured way whether the board intended to address how the compliance patrol was conducted during active blizzard conditions, and whether a financial accounting would be provided showing whether any of the fines had been processed before being voided. Gerald said no fines had been processed and no money had been collected, and he committed to providing a written financial statement confirming that within 2 weeks. Another hand, Patricia Mercer, the woman who had been fined for a vehicle that wasn't in her driveway. She stood up and explained her situation. She said she wanted to know how the compliance patrol produced an incorrect address and what the board intended to do about the fact that she had received a formal notice accusing her of a violation she had nothing to do with. Gerald acknowledged the error and apologized. He said the board would provide her with a formal written retraction. Then Kevin Nakamura stood up. Kevin is about 5'9", lean, well-dressed even in casual clothes, and he has the very calm, very precise manner of someone who spends a lot of time in professional settings where precision matters. He identified himself as a resident, an affected homeowner, and an attorney, though he was speaking as a resident and not in a legal capacity at this meeting. He said that he and several other affected homeowners had reviewed the HOA's bylaws and wanted to raise a specific provision. He cited the section of the bylaws that addresses board member conduct. Specifically, the provision that says board members may be removed by a vote of the community membership if they are found to have abused their authority, acted in bad faith, or taken actions contrary to the governing documents of the association. Kevin said he believed the evidence supported a finding that the compliance patrol conducted during the storm, which issued violation notices using a rule that explicitly permits the activity being cited, and which included at minimum 1 notice issued to the wrong property, met the standard for abuse of authority. He sat back down. The room was very quiet for about 3 seconds. Brenda Whitmore then made a tactical error that I genuinely could not have anticipated, even though in retrospect it was entirely consistent with who she is. She leaned forward in her chair, pointed her pen at Kevin, and said, in front of 60 people, that she had the authority to conduct compliance patrols at any time under the HOA's governing documents, that she used her own judgment about when violations were occurring, and that the residents of this community who couldn't be bothered to follow the rules during a snow emergency were the problem, not her. Several things happened simultaneously. I heard at least a dozen people in the room either gasp or start talking under their breath. Gerald Pratt closed his eyes briefly in a way that suggested he was having a very bad time. One of the other board members leaned away from Brenda slightly, as if creating physical distance from the situation, and I reached into my bag and pulled out my laptop, which was preloaded with the security camera footage from Thursday. I had asked Gerald in advance if I could present the footage at the meeting, and he had said yes. I raised my hand, Gerald nodded at me, and I stood up and explained that I had footage from my home security system of the compliance patrol on Thursday during the storm. I connected my laptop to the projector system and pulled up the footage. 60 people watched Brenda Whitmore walking down the sidewalk in the blizzard, stopping at my driveway, looking at my truck, writing on her clipboard, and continuing on. The timestamp was clear. The weather conditions were visible. The snow was coming down hard in the footage, and the wind was obviously affecting things. Someone in the room said out loud, "She went out in that during the emergency," and someone else said, "While the governor said stay home, I didn't say anything. I didn't need to." Then something happened that I had not planned for, and that made the whole meeting take a different turn. Tom Gallagher, who was sitting 3 rows back, stood up and said he had something to add. He said that during the storm on Thursday, he had been outside briefly to shovel his front walk and had spoken to me across the street. He said he saw Brenda conducting the compliance walk. But he also said that at approximately 2 in the afternoon on Thursday, he had called the HOA's non-emergency contact number because a large tree branch had fallen in the common area near the Birchwood Lane Park and was blocking part of the path. He'd left a message. The branch was a safety concern because it had fallen on an area where the ice was bad. The branch had never been addressed. Tom said it was still there, still blocking the path as of that morning. He had photos on his phone, and the timestamp on the photos showed Thursday afternoon and also that morning. So Brenda had found the energy to walk the entire neighborhood in blizzard conditions to write up driveway parking violations, but the HOA had not found the energy to address an actual safety hazard in the common area that was reported during the same storm period. Gerald Pratt did not look good at this point. He accepted Tom's photos and said the branch would be addressed immediately. Then someone in the back of the room raised their hand and asked whether Brenda had the authority to issue violations and fines unilaterally, or whether the violations required board approval. This was a good question that I had also looked into. The answer, per the bylaws, is that the compliance chair can issue initial notices of violation, but fines above $100 require approval from a majority of the board. The notices Brenda issued were for $250, which meant they should have required board approval before being issued. Gerald confirmed this interpretation quietly. He said the fines had not been approved by the board before being issued, which meant Brenda had issued fines she was not authorized to issue, under a rule that didn't support them, for activity that was explicitly permitted. Kevin raised his hand again and said that based on that information, the affected homeowners would be formally requesting a membership vote on the question of removing Brenda Whitmore from the compliance chair position for cause. He said they would be submitting the formal written petition required under the bylaws within 10 days. Brenda said, still with that composed expression that was starting to crack slightly at the edges, that she would like to see anyone try. Gerald said, "Brenda," in a very quiet, very controlled way that communicated an entire paragraph worth of meaning. The meeting wrapped up with Gerald committing to the following: written confirmation of all voided fines within 1 week, a written financial accounting showing no fine money had been processed within 2 weeks, a written retraction to Patricia Mercer within 1 week, immediate removal of the fallen tree branch from the common area, and a formal board review of the compliance patrol process to be completed before the next quarterly meeting. On the way out, 6 different people stopped me to thank me or shake my hand or ask about the petition process. The Acafer family, James and Sarah, told me they were so relieved because they had genuinely been losing sleep over the fine, worrying about it. Their 4-year-old was with them, hiding behind James's leg and staring at everyone with enormous eyes. I told them it was all going to be fine and meant it. Now, here is where the story adds another layer, because just when I thought we were in the cleanup phase, something came to light that changed the stakes considerably. 3 days after the meeting, Kevin Nakamura called me. He sounded serious in a way that he hadn't before. He said he'd been doing some additional review of the HOA's financial records, which are available to members under the bylaws, and he had found something that concerned him. He had been looking at the fine revenue records for the past 2 years, and he had found a pattern of fines that seemed to be concentrated in certain areas of the neighborhood and certain demographic groups of homeowners, in amounts that did not match the fine schedule in the governing documents. He had also found that the HOA's reserve fund was significantly underfunded compared to what the annual financial statements suggested it should be. He said he wasn't certain what he was looking at yet, but that he wanted to bring in an accountant to review the records before saying anything definitive. I asked him what his gut told him. He was quiet for a moment, and then said his gut told him that fine revenue over the past 2 years had not all been accounted for properly in the official records. That's the kind of thing you don't say without being careful, because the implications are serious. We agreed to keep it quiet until Kevin had an accountant review the documents. He filed a formal request with the HOA for complete financial records for the past 3 years, which members are entitled to under state law. The board, specifically Gerald, provided them within the required time frame. The accountant Kevin brought in, a woman named Susan Cole who does forensic accounting and had helped Kevin with a professional matter previously, spent about a week reviewing the documents. Kevin kept me updated at a high level without sharing specifics until she was done. Her findings were significant. Over the past 22 months, there was a gap between the fine revenue that should have been collected based on the violation notices on record and the fine revenue that appeared in the HOA's bank statements. The gap was just under $4,000. The records were not organized in a way that made it easy to identify exactly where the money had gone, but the money was not in the accounts it should have been in, and there was no documentation showing it had been spent on anything legitimate. $4,000. In an HOA budget for a neighborhood of about 90 homes, $4,000 is meaningful. Kevin and I met in person to talk through what this meant. He said this was beyond the scope of what we could resolve internally. He said that if fine money had been collected and not deposited into the HOA's accounts, that was potentially embezzlement. He said he had an obligation as an attorney and as a member of the community to report it to the appropriate authority, and he was going to do so regardless of where it led. We agreed that we would first present the findings to Gerald Pratt privately, give him the opportunity to see what Susan had found, and tell him that we intended to report it to the police. Kevin felt strongly that Gerald deserved the chance to respond before we went to the authorities, because Gerald might not have known anything about it, and we had no evidence that he did. The problem, based on everything we could see, pointed in one direction, and that direction was Brenda Whitmore, who had been the one issuing fines and who had more control over the collection and recording of fine payments than anyone else on the board. Kevin set up a meeting with Gerald. Just the 3 of us, at Gerald's house. Gerald let us in and sat at his kitchen table and listened to Kevin walk through Susan Cole's findings with the documents spread out on the table. Gerald's face went through several different phases. First, doubt, then growing concern, then genuine distress, and finally a kind of settled seriousness. When Kevin finished, Gerald said, "I didn't know." He said it simply and directly, and I believed him. He said he had never handled fine collection personally and had relied on Brenda's reports completely. He said he should have been more diligent in reviewing the financials himself, and he accepted responsibility for that oversight. Then he said, "What do we do now?" Kevin said we were reporting it to the police and that the board would need to cooperate fully with any investigation. Gerald nodded immediately and said he would cooperate with everything and would not alert Brenda to the investigation before the police had the opportunity to look into it. Kevin filed a report with the local police department's financial crimes unit the following morning. He brought Susan Cole's accounting analysis and all the financial documents. The detective who received the case took it seriously from the first meeting and said they would subpoena additional financial records as part of the investigation. I'll be honest with you. The next few weeks were a strange combination of normal winter life and this underlying awareness that something significant was happening. We had another cold snap in mid-January that broke pipes in several houses on the block, including mine, which cost me a very unpleasant few days dealing with a plumber and the drywall repair that came after. My wife and I were exhausted from the baby and the cold and the ongoing situation with the HOA. There were moments where I thought, is this worth it? Should I have just paid the fine and moved on? And then I remembered Patricia Mercer being fined for a car that wasn't in her driveway. I remembered James and Sarah Acaffer losing sleep over a completely bogus fine in their first year in the neighborhood. I remembered that $4,000 in fine money might have been going into someone's pocket, and I kept going. The police investigation moved faster than I expected. Financial crimes cases can take a long time because you have to follow the money through bank records and financial documents, but apparently the record-keeping in this particular case was not especially sophisticated. The detective called Kevin about 3 weeks after the report was filed and said they had obtained Brenda Whitmore's personal bank records under a court order and found deposits that corresponded in amounts and timing to the fine revenue gap Susan Cole had identified. Brenda Whitmore was arrested on a Wednesday morning in early February. I know this because Tom Gallagher saw the police car outside her house and texted me, and then it was confirmed in the local news that afternoon. The charge was theft of funds from a nonprofit organization, which is a felony under state law. The HOA is incorporated as a nonprofit entity. It was not a comfortable feeling, honestly. I want to be clear about that. Watching a neighbor get arrested is not satisfying in the way that winning an argument is satisfying. It's complicated and a little heavy even when you believe the outcome is right. My wife and I talked about it that night, and she said something I thought was true, that Brenda had made her own choices, and that the people who were really wronged were the neighbors who had been paying fines that weren't going to the community they were supposed to support. The HOA called an emergency membership meeting 2 weeks after the arrest. Gerald Pratt stood at the front of the room, looking tired but composed, and disclosed the full situation to the community. He explained the financial gap that had been identified, that the matter was now being handled by the police and the justice system, and that the board was committed to full transparency going forward. He announced that the board had immediately implemented a new financial oversight process, requiring 2 board member approval for all fine collection and a monthly reconciliation of fine records to bank statements. He also announced that Brenda Whitmore was suspended from all HOA functions pending resolution of the criminal matter. He then opened the floor for questions and took every single one for about 45 minutes. Some were angry, some were practical, some were just people trying to understand what had happened. Gerald answered honestly, acknowledged what the board hadn't known and what they should have caught earlier, and didn't make excuses. After the questions, he proposed that the board conduct an audit of all fines collected over the past 3 years to identify any homeowners who may have paid fines that were improperly issued or improperly applied, with the intent of providing refunds where appropriate from the HOA's operating funds. The membership voted to approve the audit by an overwhelming margin. The petition to remove Brenda Whitmore from the board had already been submitted by Kevin and the 5 original affected households, and with the arrest, it was really just a formality. The membership vote on removal was held at the same meeting and was essentially unanimous. She was removed from the board that night. The HOA then held a special election to fill her vacant seat. Patricia Mercer, who had been fined for a car that wasn't there, ran for the seat and won. I voted for her happily. Now here's the part where things wrap up in a way I genuinely did not expect, and I mean that in the best possible way. The 3-year audit that the board commissioned came back in early March. The auditors found that, in addition to the nearly $4,000 in unaccounted-for fine revenue, there were a number of older fines over the 3-year period that had been issued under questionable interpretations of the rules, similar to what had happened with the snow emergency driveway fines. Not all of them were necessarily improper, but the auditors flagged several dozen that had been issued without board approval for fine amounts above the threshold. Same issue as our situation. The board provided refunds to affected homeowners for those fines. The total refund amount came to just over $6,000, which came out of the HOA's operating reserves. It was a significant hit to the reserves, but the community voted to approve it because it was the right thing to do. Brenda Whitmore eventually pled guilty to the theft charge. She was ordered to make full restitution to the HOA, pay court costs, and received a suspended sentence with probation, meaning she served no jail time. People had mixed feelings about that, but Kevin told me that the restitution and the guilty plea creating a permanent record were actually meaningful consequences. She lost her standing in the community, had a felony conviction, and owed the HOA nearly $4,000. The HOA received the full restitution within 60 days because apparently her family helped her pay it to avoid further legal entanglement. By April, the whole thing was wrapped up. The community was different afterward, in a good way. More people showed up to HOA meetings. More people read the governing documents. The board, now with Patricia Mercer on it and with Gerald Pratt taking a more hands-on role in financial oversight, was more transparent and more communicative. They started sending a monthly email newsletter with a financial summary so everyone could see where money was coming from and where it was going. Attendance at quarterly meetings went from a handful of people to reliably 30 or 40. Kevin Nakamura joined the board the following fall when another seat opened up due to term limits. Tom Gallagher became the unofficial community liaison, the guy everyone knew you could call if you had an HOA question or concern, and he was remarkably good at it. The $250 fine that started all of this, never paid, never will, formally voided in writing with a letter that I printed out and put in the file I keep for house-related documents. It's in a folder between my homeowner's insurance policy and my property tax records. My truck still parks in my driveway every day because it's my driveway and that's what driveways are for. The following winter, the city issued another snow emergency declaration in early February. A significant storm, not quite as bad as the one from the year before, but still a serious one. 8 or 9 inches, blowing and drifting, ugly conditions. I got home ahead of the worst of it and pulled my truck into the driveway. At some point during the afternoon, I looked out my front window and saw Tom Gallagher across the street doing the same thing, pulling his truck onto his driveway. He saw me looking out and gave me a thumbs up. I gave him one back. No compliance patrol appeared during that storm. No violation notices came through the mailbox slot. No fine envelopes arrived on the morning after. Just 16 inches of snow, a cleared driveway, a truck parked exactly where it belonged, and a neighborhood that had learned, in a pretty spectacular way, that the rules actually mean what they say, and that the people enforcing them are accountable to the same documents they use to police everyone else. My daughter, who was 4 months old during the storm that started everything, is now past her first birthday and has absolutely no idea that her dad spent several months of her infant life fighting an HOA battle over a snow emergency. But someday when she's older, I'll tell her. I'll tell her about the blizzard and the notice in the mailbox and the security camera footage and the accountant and the community meeting with 60 people in a room that was supposed to hold 40. I'll tell her about Kevin Nakamura standing up in that room with calm, precise precision, about Tom Gallagher who called about a fallen tree branch and made a point that stuck, about Patricia Mercer who got fined for a car that wasn't in her driveway and then won a board seat. I'll tell her that the HOA tried to fine me for parking in my own driveway during a snow emergency, and that we didn't pay a dime, and that by the end of it the person who issued the fine was out of a board position, out of nearly $4,000 in restitution, and had a felony conviction on her record. And I'll tell her that it all came down to knowing your rights, reading the actual rules, keeping your camera footage, and finding out that when you stand up and do things correctly, the people around you tend to stand up with you. That winter was cold and exhausting and expensive in the way that winters always are, with the frozen pipes and the heating bills and the ice on everything and the gray slush piled at every curb. But it was also, in a strange way, one of the better winters I can remember, because something that started as pure frustration ended with a community that was actually functioning the way a neighborhood is supposed to function. My driveway stays full. My truck stays exactly where it's supposed to be. And I read every HOA notice I received very, very carefully.